We have this idea that American history is a straight line, a slow and steady march of progress, always moving forward. But what if that's completely wrong? What if the entire course of the nation, the America you know today, wasn't shaped by gradual evolution, but was bent, broken, and radically redirected by a handful of earth-shattering moments? These weren't just bumps in the road. They were hairpin turns that sent the United States hurtling in a totally new direction. These are moments of stunning ambition, brutal conflict, and profound moral reckoning. From a revolutionary document that told an empire where to go, to a massive land deal that doubled the country overnight. These are the events that truly changed America's course forever. Before 1776, the America we think of just didn't exist. There were 13 colonies, basically overseas franchises of the British Empire, all subjects of a king thousands of miles away. But under the surface, a radical idea was catching fire, an idea that would not only start a revolution, but become the philosophical soul of a new nation. The event that poured gasoline on that fire was the Declaration of Independence. But in 1776, putting your name on that paper was a death warrant. It was a formal public act of treason against the biggest military superpower on the planet. The revolution it inspired created the first modern republic and sparked independence movements around the world. But the Declaration's real, lasting power was in defining the American ideal. It set the high bar the nation would have to try and clear for centuries, the one that planted a time bomb in the nation's foundation. The issue of slavery was a poison that threatened to kill the United States before it was even born. Southern delegates were crystal clear: protect slavery or we walk. Covering land that would one day become states like Montana had been secretly handed over from a weak Spain to a very powerful and very ambitious France, led by Napoleon Bonaparte. But when Monroe got there, he was hit with one of the most stunning offers in history. And nowhere in the Constitution did it say the president could go out and buy a foreign empire. It doubled the size of the United States overnight for pennies an acre. The impact was instant and huge. It gave America control of the continent's most important river, kicked other colonial powers out of the heartland, and at its heart, the non-negotiable issue was slavery. As the country pushed west, the fight over whether slavery should expand into the new territories reached a boiling point. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, which basically said black people had no rights, and John Brown's violent raid on Harper's Ferry, pushed both sides past the point of no return. A deep-seated feeling of isolationism was the default setting for American foreign policy. The country was devastated, and the last thing anyone wanted was to get involved in someone else's war. Even as Nazi Germany tore through Europe and Imperial Japan brutalized Asia, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had to walk a tightrope, sending aid to the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, all while promising to keep American boys home. But the absolute catastrophe of the Second World War would drag America out of its shell, throw it onto the world stage, and transform it into the most powerful nation on the planet. The Day of Infamy slammed the door on isolationism for good. America declared war on Japan, and a few days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the U.S. America was now all in a global two-front war. This was the moment America became a global superpower, a job it never really wanted but suddenly couldn't refuse. When Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860 on a platform of stopping slavery's expansion, that was it for the South. Terrified of losing their slave-based economy and society, 11 states seceded and formed the Confederacy, and unleashed a powerful and dangerous idea: manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were chosen by God to spread across the continent. This was a modern war, with railroads, moving troops, and telegraphs flashing orders. First, and most importantly, it led to the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and freed 4 million people, finally starting to pay down the nation's original sin. That promise of freedom would be betrayed by a century of racist Jim Crow laws. But it was a fundamental break with the past. Second, the war settled the question of who was really in charge. It proved that the United States was one indivisible nation, not just a club that states could leave whenever they felt like it. The idea that states could just ignore federal law was crushed on the battlefield. The war also supercharged industry in the North, paving the way for America to become an economic giant. The Civil War tested the very meaning of America. It destroyed one version of the country. A republic built on slavery and gave birth to another, a more powerful industrial nation that was now, at least on paper, committed to the idea that all its people are free. The casualty numbers from battles like Antietam and Gettysburg were simply unimaginable. For a long time, the North's main goal was just to preserve the Union. But as the war dragged on and the bodies piled up, Lincoln realized you couldn't save the Union without killing slavery. His Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 didn't free all the slaves overnight, but it decisively shifted the purpose of the war. It was no longer just a fight to keep the country together. It was a fight for human freedom. It opened up a vast territory of resources and land for generations of settlers. But this empire of liberty was also an empire of conquest. The purchase accelerated the brutal removal of Native Americans. And crucially, it dragged the toxic issue of slavery into all that new land. Every time a new state was carved out of the territory, it ignited a furious fight over whether it would be free or slave, pushing the nation one step closer to civil war. He privately fretted that the deal was unconstitutional, but the opportunity was just too big to ignore. This was a chance to secure the nation's future and avoid a disastrous war. Jefferson rolled the dice, setting aside his principles for what he saw as the greater good. Napoleon's grand plans for a new world empire were in shambles. A massive slave rebellion in Haiti had wrecked his army, and he was about to start another war with Britain. Suddenly, Louisiana looked less like an asset and more like a headache. He needed cash, and he needed it yesterday. So, he offered to sell the entire thing, all 827,000 square miles, for just $15 million. For President Thomas Jefferson, this was a nightmare scenario. He said that whoever controlled New Orleans was America's natural and habitual enemy. American farmers in the West depended on the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans to sell their goods. If Napoleon decided to close it, the American economy could be strangled. The American Civil War wasn't just a turning point. It was America's crucible. It was a trial by fire that would either incinerate the United States or forge it into something entirely new. It is still the deadliest, most painful conflict in American history. A war that decided if the country would even exist and what that country would truly stand for. They demanded that enslaved people, who they treated as property, be counted when figuring out how many representatives each state got in Congress. The sickeningly cynical deal they struck was the 3/5 compromise, counting 3/5 of the slave population. This gave the South way more power in the government for decades. They also got a fugitive slave clause, a promise that the international slave trade would be outlawed for at least 20 years. It was a deal with the devil, a morally bankrupt bargain made just to keep the country from shattering. Every major fight to come the struggle to end slavery, the movement for women's voting rights. The battle for civil rights would call back to the promises made in 1776. The U.S. Constitution created a revolutionary new system, government of we the people, with checks and balances to keep any one branch from getting too powerful. The future was anything but certain, with European giants like Britain, France, and Spain still throwing their weight around the continent. But one single, mind-boggling real estate deal would change everything, redefining America's size, its ambition, and its very soul. This was the Louisiana Purchase. It was a blueprint for political life that has somehow survived for over 2 centuries. This convention was the moment the United States went from being a flimsy alliance to a real nation. It built the engine of government, but by punting on the issue of slavery. It also guaranteed that engine would one day violently break down. The document was deeply flawed. Of course, written by a man who owns slaves, a hypocrisy that haunts the nation to this day. But by putting those ideals of liberty and self-government on paper, the Declaration locked the country into a permanent, often painful, but vital argument with itself. It was the moment America was born, not as a collection of colonies, but as a nation founded on a world-changing idea. Tensions were at a boiling point. Colonists were furious about taxation without representation. British soldiers in their cities, "You've won a war against all odds." Awesome. But now what? How do you actually build a country that can survive in a world of hungry empires? That turned out to be the hardest part. In the years after the Revolution, the United States was falling apart. The first rulebook, the Articles of Confederation, created a central government so weak it was basically useless. It couldn't tax anyone, couldn't control trade, and couldn't stop the states from acting like squabbling toddlers. The country was broke, divided, and looked like an easy target, and the feeling that their rights as Englishmen were being systematically erased. But to do something truly radical, tear it up and start over. It was a clash of titans: James Madison, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton. They were there to build a machine, a government that could actually last. The debates were intense, revealing just how fragile the new nation really was. How do you balance the power between big states and small states? That led to the Great Compromise, creating two houses of Congress: the House, based on population, and the Senate, where every state got an equal say. The Revolutionary War had already kicked off a year earlier, but it was a war without a clear goal. Were they fighting for a better deal from the king, or for something else entirely? It's easy to look at the Declaration now as just another historical document full of fancy words we memorized in school. It didn't just list complaints, it's laid out a whole new philosophy for how governments should work. The words, penned by Thomas Jefferson and edited by the Continental Congress, were explosive. We hold these truths to be self-evident: that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was more than a breakup letter to King George. It was a mission statement for humanity. It argued that governments get their power from the people, not from God. And if a government messes that up, the people have the right to change it, or get rid of it. The Declaration of Independence answered that question like a thunderclap. It did something nobody saw coming. This was the pivot. It turned a tax dispute into a global struggle for freedom. It gave the soldiers freezing at Valley Forge a reason to fight. So, you've declared independence. This crisis led to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. 55 men gathered in a stuffy room in Philadelphia that summer, not to fix the old system, but then came the darker compromise. What came out of that room was a document that was both brilliant and deeply flawed. In 1803, America was still a young, scrappy nation, mostly huddled on the East Coast. The story starts with a panic: the massive Louisiana Territory stretching from New Orleans deep into the continent. Jefferson sent James Monroe to Paris with a simple mission: try to buy New Orleans, maybe a bit of Florida, for around $10 million. This put Jefferson in a tough spot. He was a man who believed the government could only do what the Constitution explicitly said it could do. The Louisiana Purchase was, no exaggeration, the deal of the century. Every ugly compromise, every moral contradiction, every sin from the nation's founding finally came due in 1861. The time bomb planted in the Constitution slavery went off. The causes were complex, tangled up in economics and politics. But don't let anyone tell you it wasn't about slavery. The war that came next was fought on a scale of brutality America had never known. The Union victory in 1865 changed America forever. For most of its history, America tried to follow George Washington's advice: stay out of Europe's drama and avoid entangling alliances. As war exploded across Europe and Asia in the 1930s, America was busy with its own five-alarm fire: the Great Depression. That all changed on December 7, 1941. The surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was a national trauma that united a divided country overnight. The American war effort was an industrial miracle. Factories that made cars were now cranking out tanks and bombers at a dizzying speed. This arsenal of democracy, as FDR called it, didn't just arm its own massive military. It supplied its allies, Britain and the Soviet Union. And all of that economic activity did what the New Deal couldn't. It finally slammed the door on the Great Depression, creating millions of jobs. The war also shook up society. Millions of women went to work in factories, and African Americans who served in the military and defense industries came home more determined than ever to fight for their own civil rights. When the war ended in 1945, the world's power structure had been completely rearranged. The old European empires were broke and in ruins. America, on the other hand, emerged with its homeland untouched, its economy roaring. And as the only country with the most terrifying weapon ever invented, the atomic bomb. Using that bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki not only ended the war but kicked off the nuclear age, changing the rules of war and geopolitics forever. In the aftermath, America took the lead in building the post-war world, helping create the United Nations and new global economic systems. It had accepted its new role, not just as a player in world affairs, but as the leader of the free world. World War II ended American isolationism and launched the American century, setting the stage for the Cold War and defining the nation's global role for the rest of the 20th century and beyond. A full century after the Civil War supposedly guaranteed freedom. That promise was still a cruel joke for millions of African Americans. Across the South, a vicious system of racial segregation called Jim Crow enforced second-class citizenship with laws and lynchings. Black Americans were denied the right to vote, trapped in underfunded schools, and faced daily violence and humiliation. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s was a heroic, world-changing struggle to finally force the nation to live up to its own founding promises. It was a second founding, a moment that profoundly changed the legal and moral landscape of the country. This didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on decades of courageous activism, but it caught fire in the post-war years. A major turning point was the 1954 Supreme Court decision in Brown v. Board of Education, which declared that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This ruling ripped the legal foundation out from under segregation. In the years that followed, a wave of nonviolent protests swept the South, from the Montgomery bus boycott, sparked by Rosa Parks' refusal to give up her seat, to the sit-ins where brave students challenged segregated lunch counters. The movement had visionary leaders like Martin Luther King Jr., whose powerful speeches and philosophy of nonviolent resistance called on the nation's conscience. The images from this era are burned into America's memory. Peaceful marchers in Birmingham being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. The massive, hopeful crowd at the 1963 March on Washington, where King shared his dream. The horrific beatings of protesters on the bridge in Selma, Alabama, on what became known as Bloody Sunday. These moments, broadcast on TV, showed the whole world the ugly truth of segregation and made it impossible for the federal government to keep looking away. That pressure led to two of the most important laws in American history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark bill that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It officially ended segregation in public spaces and banned discrimination in the workplace. A year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, which tore down racist barriers like literacy tests and finally gave the 15th Amendment real power, allowing millions of Black Americans to vote for the first time. The impact of the civil rights movement was revolutionary. It dismantled the legal architecture of Jim Crow. But it went even further. Its strategies and moral authority inspired a whole new generation of activism, fueling movements for women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and more. It forced a national reckoning with racism that we are still dealing with today. The movement didn't end racial injustice, but it fundamentally changed the nation's laws and ideals, marking the most significant expansion of American democracy since the ink dried on the Constitution. For most Americans, the morning of September 11, 2001 was just another Tuesday. The Cold War was over, the nation felt safe, and the biggest worry was the dot-com bubble. That sense of security was vaporized in 102 minutes. The coordinated terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon weren't just a tragedy, they were a historical fault line. It was the moment the post-Cold War era ended and the world was plunged into a new, frightening, and uncertain age. The shock was on the scale of Pearl Harbor. For the first time since 1812, the U.S. mainland had suffered a devastating foreign attack. And this time, it was broadcast live for the entire world to see. The collapse of the Twin Towers became a horrifying symbol of American vulnerability. The immediate aftermath brought a rare moment of national unity, but also a deep fear and anger that would reshape America for the next generation. The U.S. government's response was swift, massive, and changed everything. A global war on terror was declared a strange, new kind of conflict against a shadowy network of terrorists, mainly Al-Qaeda. Within weeks, U.S. troops were in Afghanistan to overthrow the Taliban regime that had protected the 9/11's plotters, starting what would become America's longest war. This was followed in 2003 by the invasion of Iraq, based on claims of weapons of mass destruction and ties to the attacks that later turned out to be false. The changes at home were just as drastic. A whole new national security state was built almost overnight. The Department of Homeland Security was created, smashing 22 different federal agencies together. The Patriot Act, passed just weeks after the attacks, gave the government sweeping new surveillance powers, igniting a fierce debate about security versus liberty. That is still raging today. Air travel was changed forever, with the creation of the TSA and security measures that became a routine and often invasive part of modern life. We are still living in the shadow of 9/11s. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq cost trillions of dollars and thousands of American lives, and destabilized the Middle East. The war on terror was used to justify controversial policies like drone strikes and torture, raising hard questions about American values. At home, the attacks fueled a rise in anti-migrant and anti-Muslim sentiment. That sense of a permanent national emergency, a low-level fear, became part of the American psyche. September 11th was the event that defined the 21st century for America. It changed the nation's relationship with the world and with itself, kicking off an era of heightened security, endless war, and a whole new set of challenges we are still trying to navigate today. These moments show us that history isn't a set path. Each one sent out ripples that we still feel today, shaping our laws, our borders, and who we are. But what do you think? Are there other events you believe were even more critical in changing America's course? Drop a comment below and let me know. I read all of them. And if you love digging into the stories that shaped our world, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive. From Jefferson's defiant pen to the twisted steel of the Twin Towers, the American story is not a straight line. It's a series of earthquakes moments that tore up the old map and forced the nation to draw a new one. A Declaration of Ideals in 1776 gave the country its soul. A constitutional convention in 1787 gave it a body. A massive land deal in 1803 gave it ambition. A brutal civil war almost destroyed it, but instead gave it a new birth of freedom. World War II pushed it onto the world stage as a leader, while the civil rights movement forced it to look in the mirror. And the attacks of 9/11 redefined its sense of safety for a new century. Each of these events was a choice, a reaction to a crisis that set off a chain reaction of consequences, both good and bad. Together, they prove that a nation's destiny is never guaranteed. It's constantly being fought over and rewritten. The question is, what's the next event that will change America's course forever?